Welcome to the Psychology World podcast with me, Connor Whiteley, psychology student and international best-selling psychology author of over 30 psychology books, bringing you the latest psychology news, fascinating psychology topics and more each week. If you want to learn more, then please check out connorwhiteley.net/books. And don't forget to like and subscribe to the YouTube video or follow on your favourite podcast app. And here's the show. Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 271 of the Psychology World podcast with me, Connor Whiteley. And today's episode is on why denying youth gender-affirming care could increase suicide. And it is Tuesday, the 11th of June 2024, as I record this. So today's episode is definitely one that's important. It's critical. It's a topic that's close to my heart because I know the numbers. I hear stories from the community, and this is heartbreaking and tragic. And this is something that's heavily politicized, but I want to bring it back into the human realm, away from politics, away from the bigots, away from the haters, to be honest, because these are lives are at stake. These are amazing people that need to be helped and supported. So this is a really useful podcast episode. Looks at the facts, the figures, and this is a very sound research-based podcast episode that does help to explain why transgender youth should be allowed to access gender-affirming care. So this is a podcast episode I absolutely recommend that you listen to. So that's coming up in a few minutes. And as always, I always like to know your thoughts and feelings on today's episode. So you can always email me, connorwhiteley@connorwhiteley.net. You can always leave a comment at the show notes at connorwhiteley.net/podcast. And you can always tweet me on Twitter at sci-fi or leave a comment on the Facebook post or LinkedIn. I always love to hear from all of you because it really helps make the podcast feel more like a conversation. And today's episode has been sponsored by Working with Children and Young People, a guide to clinical psychology, psychotherapy, and mental health. So originally I was actually going to do my developmental psychology book as the sponsored product for today's episode, but I thought that working with children and young people was a lot better fit because this great, really easy to understand book really does help you to get a solid understanding about how the clinical psychologists and other mental health professionals work with children and young people to help decrease the psychological distress in improved lives and thus to support them so they can go on to live full and productive lives. So this book looks at a lot of different sections and a lot of different elements about how mental health professionals help to improve the lives of children, from child development centres to pediatric psychology, which is actually really interesting because I really like the chapters in particular that focus on how clinical psychologists help to support chronic physical conditions like chronic pain, for example. That was a very eye-opening chapter to research and actually understand it because it really does show that psychology can be useful in every single condition, not just mental health conditions. Furthermore, I will also talk about CAMS in the UK, which is the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services, and the 4 different tiers, which gives you a great understanding of clinical psychology in the UK. So if you're in the UK, then this is just going to be a really valuable resource to help you understand how clinical psychology works for your future career. But if you're in another country, then it's still it's still going to be useful, right? Because I firmly believe that we can learn valuable insight from all our different cultures and all of our different setups of that clinical psychology. So by the end of this book, you will have a really good understanding of how a clinical psychologist and other professionals work with children and young people to improve their lives. So I really do recommend this great book. It's one of my favourites, and I always recommend it. So that is Working with Children and Young People, available from all major ebook retailers, and you can get the paperback and the hardback version from Amazon, your local bookstore or local library if you request it. And you can also get the audiobook narrated by artificial intelligence at selected audiobook retailers like Spotify, Google Play, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, and selected library systems like Biblioteca, Overdrive, and Baker & Taylor. So whilst buying books helps support the creation and the editing of the podcast, my time is sponsored by my wonderful patrons. And if you want to become a patron and get access to tons of great rewards, now you can at patreon.com/the Psychology Word Podcast. Or you can buy me a coffee if you want to support the podcast on a one-off basis at buymeacoffee.com/Connor Whiteley. So that's enough of this introductory matter. Let's move on to the content part of today's episode. So we're moving on to the content part of today's episode. So we're going to be looking at why denying youth gender-affirming care could increase suicide. This is a really important episode. I really liked it, and yes, it took me a while to get to it, because this can be quite a heartbreaking topic. But this is really important, and this is a topic I'm really passionate about, because gender-affirming care does save lives. So let's dive into today's episode. Some basic facts about transgender individuals and gender dysphoria. So I wanted to kick off this podcast episode by focusing on some facts about transgender individuals and gender dysphoria based on findings from research studies, so we all understand what is actually happening. Since I know no one really investigates the truth about transgender people on their own, and a lot of people rely on negative, biased media reports for the information, and I used to be no exception. Therefore, according to Anderson and al. 2023, there are nearly 1.4 million Americans that have gender dysphoria, meaning they do not identify with the sex they were assigned at birth. As well as Parker and al. 2022 found that 64% of Americans support transgender people against discrimination. In addition, below is an extract from an introduction I wrote for an academic paper, where I was talking about the negative impact of gender dysphoria on mental health. Open quote. Half of all transgender youth report a history of suicidal idealization, James et al. 2016, and low self-esteem, McCarthy et al. 2015, emphasizing the need for mental health support for this clinical population. Also, research suggests that gender dysphoria is an additional major cause of this mental health disparity. Gender dysphoria returns to the psychological distress associated with the gender incongruence between the individual's gender assigned at birth and the gender identity, APA 2013. And gender dysphoria is associated with depression, suicidality, anxiety, and eating disorders, Peterson et al. 2017, due to the profound emotional and physical suffering the dysphoria causes an individual, Morris and Geppo, 2019. As a result, you can see how gender dysphoria leads to an increase in stark and dangerous mental health outcomes. This is why gender-affirming care is so important and why it saves lives. Below is another egg extract from my draft introduction that explains why gender-affirming care is so important, useful, and valuable in saving lives. Open quote. Gender-affirming practices aim to reduce the psychological stress caused by gender dysphoria. Kamiri and al. 2015, Olsen and al. 2016. For instance, trans-masculine participants experience improved mental health and quality of life after receiving top surgery. Dryer and al. 2019 and Testosterone 2015. Also, gender-affirming practices help participants to experience significantly lower rates of psychological distress and suicidal idealization compared to transgender individuals not undergoing gender-affirming practices. Amani and Kayura Gillian, 2021, with similar findings being found by additional studies. Sanskon et al. 2020, Swan et al. 2021. Due to gender-affirming practices aid participants in living authentically through the process of social transitioning. Social transitioning refers to the process where transgender individuals express themselves in a way that reflects their gender identity to the outside world. Austin et al. 2022. Typically, this process involves changing their clothing, hairstyle, accessories to reflect their internal state of their self more accurately, amongst other practices. Austin et al. 2022. Social transitioning has a history in psychological literature, demonstrating its profound positive impact on transgender individuals through qualitative studies. Austin and Craig 2015. For instance, using a transgender's individual chosen pronouns and a name in multiple domains of functioning, like school, home, and the workplace, caused decreased suicidal idealization by 65% and depression by 71%. Russell and al. 2018. Further, socially transitioned transgender youth who were more supported in their gender identity were found to only have minimally increased anxiety levels and developmentally normative levels of depression, suggesting mental health difficulties can be avoided in this population. Olsen et al. 2016. Consequently, research demonstrates gender-affirming practices, including social transitioning, are critical to reducing psychological distress and severe negative mental health outcomes caused by gender dysphoria. Close quote. Furthermore, Parker et al. 2022 found that Americans were seriously split on whether to allow gender-affirming surgery at all for anyone. Americans were generally undecided about whether to allow adults to have a surgery, but most Americans were flat out against allowing children under 18 to surgically change their gender. And I know there are a lot of reasons why people feel like this, and I acknowledge that the majority of these reasons are coming from a good place. But in reality, a lot of these arguments don't hold much water, especially when we investigate the mental health angle and how a gender-affirming surgery can be the difference between a child committing suicide or living. Should transgender youth have the right to determine their gender? The first argument I've heard way too much about is the idea that children are too young to understand the consequences of any medical decision. Due to, if we think about changing your pronouns, these are very easy to reverse. You can't reverse surgery. As well as Jackson et al. 2023 found that some transgender youth still commit suicide even after gender-affirming treatment. However, we still need to remember that these children aren't going through the psychological distress that gender dysphoria causes because their post-puberty state does not match the internal reflection of their gender. This dysphoria is extremely distressing, and self-harm is very, very possible, and so is suicide if we stop a child from getting any form of help because we apparently know better, and that I mean as adults. For the sake of improving the mental health of the transgender youth, they deserve the right to choose their own gender. As a result, transgender youth are in a mental health crisis. Marasi, 2006, caused by the extreme stress of there being an incongruence between the external and internal reflection of the gender. Then we need to acknowledge that if there is a failure to overcome their childhood crisis, then this can be fatal or disastrous. Jennings, 2015. Also, if children are asking for the right to choose their own gender, then it isn't because it's trendy, it's a craze, or it's a fad. It's because they don't already have it. Adults already have the right to choose their own gender, so why don't children have the same right? This is ultimately an equality question, because I have no idea what children would have to do to be treated equally to adults. Americans and anyone all over the world might have already been asking for the right to choose by people assigned a female at birth. And let me think. This is basically women asking for the right to vote so they can be treated equally by men, and people assigned black at birth. Black people wanting to be treated equally. And before women and black people gained more equal rights, they were treated like children. Women weren't allowed to work. They weren't allowed to vote because they were deemed by men to be too dim to understand politics. And they weren't allowed the freedom to do whatever they wanted with their lives. All minorities are treated as children before they gain equal rights. Everyone should have the right to choose about their own lives, so the children would be no exception. This already happens in other ways, because we allow children to dye their hair, get their hair cut, go out whenever they want with their friends, and more. So let's extend this right to choose to the really important things that ultimately save lives. And there was a brilliant and rather heartbreaking comment that I've seen that I think is so true. Remembering that minors cannot vote. It's all well and good us talking about and us spending our time debating and arguing about what minors need to feel safe, secure, and protected. At the same time, these minors are in chat rooms and planning and discussing the advantages of secret suicide. Jennings, 2015, Maracas, 2006. That is not okay, and we need to do something about this. The easiest and most effective way to decrease these secret suicide discussions is to simply allow children to choose their own gender and implement both the social and possibly medical methods of gender-affirming care. Why the agony of transgender youth matters. As aspiring and qualified psychologists, it's our job to get children out of a mental health crisis and into a safe space so children can survive. We always put the psychological needs of our client before ourselves because our client is the most important person and we need to help them. Whatever a client is going through, that is important to us as psychologists. We need to make sure that we help them so that they can get through to live a full, happy, and productive life. Their agony and distress matter to us. Also, whenever we're with our clients, we never invalidate them. We never tell someone with depression that they can't be depressed because we don't feel depression, or that depression isn't valid because it's unusual or uncommon in our culture. We never do that, but that doesn't help our clients, and it certainly doesn't help decrease their psychological distress. So let's never do that to a transgender youth either. Conclusion. At the end of the day, as adults, we need to realize that when a child is telling us that they're undergoing a gender dysphoria and they're in extreme distress, we need to treat this as a fact. The child isn't lying, and if we don't listen to them, then this could have horrific consequences. Since for transgender youth, they've undergone a mental health crisis, and unless they get support and acceptance and some form of a gender affirming, like social transitioning, is still a brilliant range, then you can think of this as a glass bottle that is getting more and more pressurized, and at some point, the glass bottle will shatter. The child will have a breakdown, and they might commit suicide. We cannot allow that to happen. You can argue as much as you want about whether gender affirming care is moral or ethical for children, but your arguments do nothing to help a grieving mother or father of a dead child. So the takeaway from this episode is don't close every door on a child's hope for acceptance, because if you do that, there will only be a single door left open for a child to take, and when they go through that door, they will not return. They will not feel like they have any other choice, and they will not be alive. Death, suicide, and pain is all that remains when we take away gender affirming care. So I know this is probably the darkest podcast episode we've done for a while, but I just wanted to do this. I wanted to get this stuff out there. And yes, I know I'm going to lose listeners to this, I'm going to lose readers. And whenever I do a trans podcast episode, I always get a lot of backlash. I always get negative emails, negative comments. I always lose listeners because, of course, how dare I stand up for trans people? But even though this keeps theoretically hurting the podcast, whenever I do a pro-trans episode, I'm still going to keep doing them because we have the research, we have the numbers, we have everything that says that unless we support transgender people, people are going to die. Really bad mental health outcomes are going to happen. And that is not okay. I cannot live with myself knowing that I have an opportunity to do something about it and me not taking it. That is not morally right, and my conscience cannot be clear unless I try and do something from time to time. So that is why I do podcast episodes like this, even though I think the vast majority of the listeners would have turned off by now, because of course this is too hard. This goes against a lot that is said in the media, and this is madness and lunacy, apparently. But we have the research. I gave you the references. I'm conducting my own transgender research at my university. Well, I'm writing up the paper now. I have friends that are trans, and etc., etc., etc. This is real, and if you are listening, I know I said this at the end of all transgender podcast episodes, but you are amazing, and I cannot thank you enough for listening, because I know this is harder, so I am really grateful that you gave me a chance to just talk about the research and to get a message across. So I really hope that you enjoyed today's episode. If you know someone else who would enjoy today's episode, then please share it with them. I'm always really grateful when you wonderful people help spread the word about the podcast. And if you want to learn more, definitely check out Working with Children and Young People, available in all the usual places. And the audiobook is available in selected audiobook retailers and library systems if you request it. Also, if you want to become a patron of the show and get access to tons of great rewards, now you can at patreon.com/The Psychology Hour Podcast. Or if you want to give the podcast a bit of like one-time support, now you can buymeacoffee.com/Conor Whiteley. So thanks for listening, everyone. Have a great day, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for listening today. I hope you found it helpful. Please remember to like the video and subscribe to the YouTube channel and follow the podcast on your favourite podcast app. And if you wanted to learn more, then please check out the backlist of the podcast episodes or my books at conwhiteley.net. So have a great day, and I'll see you next time.